Thank you very much. Great to be with you in the real Brussels also, as well as the EU and the NATO Brussels. Well, I'm no fan of NATO to begin with because NATO became an aggressive U.S. military alliance, not, of course, any longer the defensive organization to defend against a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. That became impossible with the end of the Soviet Union, and it became impossible with the dismantling of the Warsaw Pact alliance in 1990. So NATO should have been ended back in 1990, in my view. Instead, the U.S. used it as its geopolitical arm, not only to continue to dominate European politics, but also to extend U.S. power eastward, and not only to the new members of Europe, but to Russia's border. And we have the war in Ukraine because of American aggressiveness of pushing U.S. military alliances and weapon systems and missile systems to Ukraine and to Georgia over Russia's very vociferous and very reasonable red lines. Russia did not want the United States on its border, especially given that the U.S. had unilaterally abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002 and began placing anti-ballistic missile systems all over Eastern Europe, in Poland and Romania, and threatened to do so in Ukraine as well. The U.S. would not even rule out missile systems in Ukraine. Now, of course, the U.S. is targeting strikes inside Russia, deep inside Russia, with U.S. attack missiles. And this is supposed to be about peace and defense. Of course it's not. So I don't like NATO to begin with. Europe should not be subservient to the United States in foreign policy. Europe should not stop its own diplomacy, which it did. Europe basically abandoned European diplomacy from 2008 onward, when the United States started to push NATO enlargement. And I haven't heard a sensible thing from European leaders basically for 17 years on almost anything in foreign policy. They're just warmongers, just NATO wannabes. Even Ursula von der Leyen reportedly wanted to move from being the head of the European Commission to being the head of NATO, as if that was a job promotion. My God, it should be the opposite view. That why would you ever want to leave heading Europe for something like NATO? But the way that the power system has worked in the U.S.-European relations, NATO Secretary Generalship was viewed apparently as a promotion from the EU Commission, something I find completely shocking. So I think that in addition to the fact that NATO should have been disbanded, not only was it not disbanded, not only did it push eastward for U.S. geopolitical reasons, but Europe got completely confused defining the EU, which was both a peace and an economic initiative, as an adjunct of NATO. So the EU and NATO became basically the same thing. Even to join the EU is to join NATO. To join NATO is to join the EU. Not exactly, but pretty close, actually. So I think the EU lost its way. I think the United States really helped that process, guiding Europe away from its true mission, which is a mission of peace and prosperity. Europe became and remains to this day kind of an appendage of U.S. power. Even when U.S. power does not serve European interests, European values, European security, the United States calls the shots. Now, rather pathetically, Europe says, oh, we don't like what Donald Trump's doing. We want a seat at the table, and begs the United States for a seat at the table, which is absurd. If Europe had any diplomacy, it doesn't need a seat at the U.S. table. It needs its own diplomacy. So why doesn't High Representative Kallas go to Moscow for diplomacy? Why doesn't she meet with Lavrov, her counterpart? Why doesn't President Costa go to meet with President Putin? Why do they meet with Zelensky 100 times and not with their Russian counterpart even one time? This is a failure of Europe's politics. This is the basic problem.
Well, you probably heard what Callas, you mentioned her name, what she said in the beginning of her mandate about Russia. I mean, this was really almost like a declaration of war. What we want to aim for is to divide it up in little statelets and so on. And this is supposed to be the head of European diplomacy. But
yes, and I think everybody understands, or my God, everybody should understand, Russia has 5,000 nuclear warheads. Actually, around 6,000. It's got 1,600 actively deployed. What are you playing games with that? What are you trash talking, hate talking, warmongering? No, stop, especially the diplomats. The diplomats at least ought to be saying to the warmongers, let me do diplomacy. But they don't. They became the big warmongers.
Yeah.
Think of who was the biggest warmonger in Europe in the last 4 years. I'd say Annalise Baerbock, the supposed foreign minister of Germany, who was all war, no diplomacy. So this is really a problem. Europe needs diplomacy. Diplomacy means you sit with the other side. You don't say, we're going to destroy you. We want to divide you. We want to wreck you. You don't have the president of Latvia tweeting, literally, Russia delenda est, that Russia must be destroyed. A president of a neighboring country saying that about a superpower on its border? Come on, what kind of world are we in? Just inviting nuclear annihilation? No, we need some sense.
And just to emphasize this absurd situation we are in, the outgoing German government is about to be replaced by a new one, is proposing, and the new government has already said they agree, is proposing Annalena Baerbock to be the next chairperson of the UN General Assembly for the next session. I mean,
there are certain things I can't even contemplate, and that is among them.
Yeah, yes. Now, to go on, Trump, for whatever reasons, is negotiating some kind of peace agreement. Well, we call it peace, but that's also a debate in itself, what the peace means. But people like Keir Starmer and President Macron have already said, yes, and we will send our troops there to be the intermediary, which of course is a no-go for Russia. But at the what I notice is that there's an organization existing that practically nobody talks about, and I know it because I worked for it for many years, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, that could be perfect for such a job. Why is it that why is it that this option is never discussed?
Well, look, the whole point was that NATO essentially pushed the OSCE out of business. OSCE was collective security for Europe. It included the countries of the former Soviet Union, it included Central and Eastern Europe, it included Western Europe, and the whole doctrine of OSCE was very, very clear. You cannot have security at the expense of your neighbor. This was the basic point: inclusive security, collective security, not alliances and blocks. But the United States hates that. The United States says, we lead, we rule, it's our bloc, and we will antagonize Russia. We will decolonize Russia. We will break apart Russia. We will bring Russia to its knees. All of these things, which were the delusions of American foreign policy for more than 30 years, pushed OSCE aside. And of course, the US and hardliners in Europe manipulated the Parliamentary Committee of OSCE and so forth. But the charter of OSCE is very sensible. And it was exactly the opposite of the bloc approach. You know, the question was asked rhetorically, oh, why can't Ukraine join NATO? And the right answer is because it threatens Russia. And because what Ukraine joining NATO means is not Ukraine's choice, it means America sitting on Russia's border and threatening Russia's security. Well, the OSCE idea understood that, and therefore it couldn't serve America's purpose. Therefore, it was pushed aside.
Yeah, absolutely. And my experience with OSCE mission in Kosovo, where I worked there with people from Poland, with people from Spain, people from Russia, etc. And my experience was that those are really good, willing people, We might have disagreed on issues, but we found together solutions. And my impression is it is exactly because the OSCE could be a good way out for Ukraine that they won't mention it, because a good way out is something that they do not want.
That's exactly right. And my most basic idea, even aside from OSCE and NATO, it's not only my idea, it's Russia's idea, which I completely agree with. But it's a sensible idea, which is that Ukraine should be neutral and it should keep apart the superpowers. That's what the U.S. fundamentally objected to. The U.S. hates neutrality. You know, the U.S. has this famous expression, notorious expression, you're either with us or you're against us. There's nothing in between. And yet it was neutrality, in my opinion, that made it safe for Europe after even in the Cold War, because there was a swath of major countries, Sweden, Finland, Austria, Switzerland, that kept apart the potential belligerents. And those neutral countries, how did they fare during this period? They prospered like nothing else. And there was an absurd article in the New York Times, really absurd, with Alexander Stubb, the president of Finland, saying to the New York Times reporter, we need to arm Ukraine to the maximum so that it doesn't end up like Finland. And I said, are you kidding? Are you lying? What are you telling the American people? Where did Finland end up? Well, I know one thing. I publish each year the World Happiness Report. Finland ended up #1 in the happiness report year after year. It ended up rich, prosperous, happy, secure. So what are we warning Ukraine against exactly, Mr. Stubb? Come on, tell the truth. Finland did just fine as a neutral state. But that's what America doesn't want anyone to know.
And people like this president goes along with it for whatever reasons. Now, what I also admired in your lecture in the European Parliament is that you suggested, listen, for situations like Ukraine, there are existing solutions elsewhere in the world that you can look to compare. Now, I know very well that, for example, in London or in Paris, they like to mock the Belgian model and whatever, this little country that they don't understand with these two languages, etc., etc. But hey, this is not the Basque country, this is not Catalonia, this is not Northern Ireland. You know, what we do is we bicker all the time, and after that we go have a beer together.
There you go.
And I know it's a cliche, but there's a real element of truth in it, mainly that compromise is not a dirty word in Belgian politics. And I want to, because you mentioned South Tyrol in Italy,
yes,
as a possibility. And I would like to suggest to you, there's also another one that's, according to me, even more applicable, and that's almost unknown to the world. That's the protection of the ethnic German community within Belgium. It's only 60,000 people, but that system could really be something that should be looked at. Listen, how did they manage to do that? Now, why is it so important to look at these models from outside? Do you think really that is something that can give a way out of these situations?
What Belgium has accomplished is extraordinarily important and impressive. I can't say I've mastered all the intricacies of it, but if I understand correctly, there are no less than 5 parliaments. There's the parliament for Flanders, for Wallonia, for Brussels itself, for the national government, and for the German minority. So it's extremely impressive, and it works. And of course, Belgium is a highly prosperous, peaceful country where you go out and have a beer, like you said, and do just fine. And interestingly, I was in South Tyrol, which is another success story. It's the German-speaking region of Italy. It came into Italian hands after World War I, actually, with
the Germans in Belgium.
With the end of the Habsburg Empire, also part of Belgium's history, and it, oh my God, it works. It's a prosperous area, completely peaceful. Everybody likes the arrangements. It took it took a few dozen years actually to come up with the formula. But what I learned when I visited Bolzano last year was something quite interesting. And that is that the Minsk II agreement was not just resembling the South Tyrol experience, but in a way it was modeled on it. And the reason is that Angela Merkel knows South Tyrol quite well. She would come to visit the German speaking communities. And so she knows the governor, she knows the situation, she knows the autonomy. And she viewed Minsk II, which would have given autonomy to the ethnic Russian region of Ukraine, as a kind of South Tyrol. Now, the United States just can't leave well enough alone. And so it said to the Ukrainian government, you don't have to implement Minsk II, even after Minsk II was backed unanimously by the UN Security Council. It's terrible. You know, when you have the UN Security Council backing, that's the highest law of the world, should be. And you don't go telling your counterpart, you don't have to pay any attention to that. So there could have been peace in Ukraine based on a Belgian or a South Tyrol model. It's the right model. And by the way, there are countries all over the world that could benefit from this, because the whole European idea of the nation state, nation meaning an ethnicity and state meaning the governance, is phony because geographies don't come with nations unless there's ethnic cleansing, unless there's false history, unless there's repression of minorities. And so finding a way for autonomy or for respect or for security of minority groups is a worldwide need. There's so little attention to it, by the way. So few people know the Belgian model. I didn't really know the Belgian model properly. I knew a little bit about it, but until I was in Brussels recently and I had a good long lecture about it, and I learned it's not even 4, it's 5 parliaments. So I got that right. But that's because, not because I learned it in class or learned it even in my own UN experience, but because somebody educated me properly about this. And this idea that there are ways of governance of multi-ethnic societies, it's a basic imperative for our world. But boy, it's so contested, and it leads to disasters like the Ukraine war when it fails, like Palestine and Israel, which, by the way, could be one binational state. I think, pragmatically speaking, because of the history of that conflict, the two-state solution is the more likely. Now we have one absolutely destructive, I say genocidal state of Israel right now that is killing vulgarly, blatantly, massively the Palestinian people. But the point is, the solution is to find a way for different groups to live peacefully together in a pragmatic way. And Belgium offers solutions, and these other cases offer solutions, and we don't hear about them often enough.
Yeah. I even as a Belgian, I can say that our model, it's not a beautiful house. It's a house with a shed and an extra stack, and so it's not beautiful, but it's cozy and it works.
Yeah, there you go.
That is the idea. Now, Professor, thank you very much. Why I think it's so important that an international voice like yours says this, because my experience was always, when I talked about the Belgian model, especially the French or the British or even the Americans were also looking sideways, oh, what are you talking about? But a voice like yours could say, hey, listen, guys, this is really something that we look into. And by the way, because your time is limited, you mentioned visiting Bolzano. Well, if you ever come to Brussels, to Belgium again, it's not a big country.
Of course I will.
I would invite you to Eupen. Eupen, it's not a very small city. It's the capital of the German government. They have their own government, 3 ministers, one of them the prime minister, and they have a parliament of 25 people. It's a full parliament with full competences. And I really believe that, from my experience in Kosovo, from my experience in other countries, that this model has something to offer. I would not say you have to copy it, but at least you have to look at it and say, hey, there's some good ideas in it.
I'm taking you up on the invitation.
Okay, absolutely. Any final comments for our Belgian audience?
Well, just thank you for reaching out. Thank you for the good examples and the push. We really need them right now. You know, the governance is not working in two different directions. First, we need governance that's effective above the national level. We need global cooperation. We need regional cooperation. We also need governance that's effective below the national level, what we have been talking about. And yet we ended up, because of the mindset of the imperial powers like Britain, like France, like the United States, that wanted to boss other countries around, we end up with a great power mindset rather than an effective governance mindset. So I think we need to move to the idea, how do we solve these problems? These are political problems that have political solutions, and we need to work on that and not listen just to the old empires.